So, how does a democracy actually die?
Yeah, that is definitely the heavy question we're dealing with today.
Right, because, I mean, for generations, Americans thought it would look like, tanks rolling down the streets.
Or like a sudden military coup or something.
Exactly. But history shows that authoritarians, well, they much more often rise right through the ballot box.
Oh, absolutely. They exploit economic instability, they prey on cultural anxieties, and they basically rewrite history.
Yeah, and before we unpack all of that, enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this critique. Excellent for aspiring writers. If you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps guide our future content.
We really do appreciate the feedback.
And just so you know what you are tuning into today, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
It's a great format for this kind of material.
It really is. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really rigorous critique of the nonfiction book Democracy Awakening. Notes on the State of America by historian Heather Cox Richardson.
The very timely read.
Yeah, and we've specially tailored this conversation for you, especially if you're an educator or a student in grades 9 through 14, focusing on civics, politics, and U.S. history. Our mission here is to challenge your thinking and inspire some serious classroom discussion.
But before we get into the weeds, we kind of need to lay down a crucial ground rule for this critique.
Right, the impartiality rule.
Exactly. Democracy Awakening contains highly polarized, politically charged claims regarding both historical and modern left-wing and right-wing U.S. politics.
Very charged.
Yeah, so we must make it crystal clear to you, our listener, that we are absolutely not taking sides or endorsing the author's viewpoints today.
Not at all.
Instead, we are impartially reporting the ideas contained in the original source material, just to model how to apply critical reasoning to complex texts.
Right. I mean, we're here to analyze the mechanics of the argument, not to tell you who to vote for.
Exactly.
And to do that, we're going to run Richardson's book through a few specific intellectual stress tests. First up is Mortimer Adler's intellectual hierarchy.
Which is basically a way of checking if a book just throws raw information at you, or if it elevates that into true understanding.
Yeah. And then second, we'll use the Paul Elder framework. That's a critical thinking model that asks us to look past what an author is saying and examine why they are saying it.
Right, looking at the underlying assumptions and point of view.
Exactly. And finally, we'll view all this through the lens of U.S. constitutional values and the Golden Rule. So let's jump right into Adler's framework.
Sounds good. So, to move from basic information to understanding, we have to look at the timeline she builds, starting with why America managed to avoid falling into fascism during the 1930s.
Because, I mean, the Great Depression was tearing the world apart, and a lot of major nations succumbed to dictators.
Oh, absolutely. But Richardson argues that the U.S. rallied around the Declaration of Independence's core promise that all men are created equal.
Right.
And she says the primary vehicle for that was FDR's New Deal.
Okay, so she posits that the New Deal created this, muscular federal government specifically to protect ordinary citizens from extreme poverty.
Right, by building a social safety net and regulating major corporations.
Right.
FDR basically drained the swamp of economic despair that authoritarians usually exploit.
But that massive expansion of government power, it sparked an immediate backlash, didn't it?
It did. And that brings us to the 1937 Conservative Manifesto.
Wait, 1937?
Yeah, it was a formal document drafted by lawmakers who fiercely opposed business regulation, social safety nets, and federal civil rights interventions.
Wow, okay, so they pushed back hard.
They did. And Richardson argues that this manifesto was the exact moment the word conservative was deliberately redefined in American politics.
Let's unpack that because it's a fascinating shift. If you look at traditional conservatism, like tracing it to Edmund Burke in the late 1700s,
right, the historical definition.
Yeah, the philosophy wasn't about blowing up the government. It meant preserving stability and respecting existing institutions.
Exactly. You made changes slowly, based on facts on the ground. You avoided rigid ideologies.
But Richardson claims that in the mid-20th century, that pragmatic meaning was essentially hijacked.
Yes, and she points the finger specifically at William F. Buckley Jr. in 1951.
Okay, so the context here is that the New Deal had created this massive liberal consensus, right? The economy was booming.
Right, both parties generally agreed on how things should run. But then Buckley steps in and explicitly aims to overturn that entire consensus.
Just completely dismantle it.
Yeah. He pushes an ideology of entirely free, unregulated markets combined with strict religious traditionalism. He creates what the book calls movement conservatism.
Okay, wait, let me push back on this with an analogy.
Sure, go ahead.
Imagine a famous legacy brand completely changes its recipe. The ingredients are totally different, the taste is different, but they keep the exact same label on the bottle. Is it still the same product?
Well, that's a great way to put it.
Because Richardson is arguing that movement conservatives took the trusted label of conservative but completely discarded its historical Burkean meaning.
Right.
She actually links true American conservatism back to Abraham Lincoln, arguing he used the federal government to defend equality. But is her definition universally accepted? Or is she selectively interpreting history to frame modern conservatives as radicals?
Well, that's the million-dollar question.
Sure.
Because redefining a label is the ultimate political weapon.
It really is.
By claiming the mantle of Lincoln and Burke for her own progressive vision, she marginalizes the modern political right as an aberration.
Right.
But whether a reader views Buckley's movement as a radical departure or a necessary correction, her core argument is that this ideology was weaponized to dismantle the existing political order.
Which perfectly transitions us into using the Paul Elder framework.
Yeah, to understand the extreme polarization today, we have to look at the assumptions and implications of how that liberal consensus fell apart.
Right, because like we said, most politicians, Republican and Democrat, agreed the government should regulate business and build infrastructure.
Exactly.
So if it was so popular, how did it unravel so fast?
According to Richardson, the Achilles heel of that consensus was race. Specifically, the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board of Education.
Oh, wow. So when the federal government finally began enforcing civil rights...
Right, dismantling school segregation. Opponents saw a massive political opportunity.
Okay.
The book argues that political operatives deliberately used racial fears to turn white voters who had previously supported the New Deal against the concept of a strong federal government.
Yeah, and the text gets into the mechanics of how this was executed. It points to Richard Nixon's Southern strategy in the late 1960s.
Exactly. Nixon realized he couldn't use explicitly racist language.
Right, so his campaign used coded language like law and order and states' rights.
Yes, to quietly promise a rollback of civil rights enforcement.
And the book traces this straight to the Reagan Revolution in 1980. Richardson notes, Reagan used the Make America Great, again, rhetoric specifically to appeal to voters feeling displaced by minorities and women.
And this wasn't just happening in political campaigns. The media landscape was changing to support it, notably with the 1987 elimination of the Fairness Doctrine.
This is huge. For those who don't know, the Fairness Doctrine required broadcasters to present contrasting viewpoints on controversial issues.
Right, if you gave airtime to one side, you had to give time to the other.
So removing that completely altered the psychology of the American voter.
It did. It paved the way for partisan talk radio to, as the text says, flood the zone with misinformation.
Because without it, there was no shared baseline of facts.
Exactly. And authoritarians rely heavily on feeding people a manufactured mythological past to make them feel like something was stolen from them.
Which we see constantly today with historical narratives. The text uses the 1619 Project, which centers human enslavement in our national narrative.
Right.
And she contrasts that with the Trump administration's 1776 Commission, claiming it was designed to promote a mythological past just to galvanize a political base.
It's an intense debate.
Yeah.
And this is a great time to remind you that you are listening to Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques inspiring reflection and rational thought for educators and students alike.
So getting back to the Paul Elder concept of point of view, we really need to examine Richardson's own lens here.
Okay, let's do that.
She frames almost all opposition to that mid-century consensus as rooted in white supremacy or the greed of the ultra-wealthy. Think of a seesaw.
Right.
She argues one side is deliberately holding the other down out of malice. But is she ignoring the possibility that some actors genuinely believe smaller government is objectively better for everyone?
That's a very fair point to raise.
Does she have a blind spot regarding legitimate good faith philosophical debates over federal power versus state sovereignty?
It's a vital question. A traditional conservative would argue that a bloated federal bureaucracy inherently stifles innovation and individual liberty.
Exactly.
The book definitely attributes highly malicious motives to the architects of movement conservatism. But her counter-argument is that, historically, states' rights has almost exclusively been invoked to protect local hierarchies.
I see.
But regardless of the motives, Her broader point is about the tactics used to gain power and their real-world consequences on democratic institutions.
Which brings us to the ultimate test of constitutional values. Let's evaluate her vision using the U.S. preamble values, like establishing justice and promoting the general welfare.
Right, and the modified golden rule, prioritizing basic human needs over the desires of the powerful.
Yeah, Richardson claims a political minority has successfully skewed the system to maintain power.
And she backs that up with specific structural mechanics. She cites aggressive gerrymandering.
Where politicians draw district lines to guarantee re-election.
Exactly. She also points to the Electoral College and the routine use of the Senate filibuster.
Tools that mathematically amplify a minority of voters.
Right. But most critically, she points to the judicial branch's embrace of originalism.
Okay, originalism is the theory that judges should interpret the Constitution solely based on its original understanding in the late 1700s.
Yes. And she argues this is used to strip the federal government's ability to protect equal rights. The prime example is overturning Roe v. Wade.
Wow.
And she draws a highly provocative parallel here, comparing this modern push for states' rights to pre-Civil War enslavers like George Fitzhugh.
Right, Fitzhugh literally argued that a wealthy, educated minority should rule over the masses without their consent.
Exactly. Richardson sees modern originalism as an echo of that hierarchical mindset.
But to counter this narrative, she recenters American history on marginalized people.
She does.
She argues the elites didn't secure democracy. It was the historically excluded people who fought to make the Declaration's promise a reality.
The historical examples she weaves in are so powerful. She highlights Doris Miller, a black messman in the segregated Navy at Pearl Harbor.
Right, who manned an anti-aircraft gun with extraordinary heroism despite his non-combat role.
Yes, demonstrating profound loyalty to a democracy that didn't treat him as an equal.
And she highlights Russi Taylor and Rosa Parks, too.
Exactly. And she frames Rosa Parks not just as a tired woman on a bus, but highlights her dangerous early work for the NAACP.
Right, organizing against racial violence. And she brings up Fannie Lou Hamer's fearless voting rights activism in Mississippi.
Taking severe beatings just to register black citizens. And sitting bold, demanding the government honor its treaties.
So the point is that the fight for democracy has almost always been led by those who suffered most when it failed.
Precisely.
It's compelling narrative. But let me introduce another analogy to test her structural argument. Think of a rigged board game, like Monopoly.
Okay.
If the rules say I collect $400 when I pass go, but you only collect $200, I'm technically not cheating.
You're just following the rules.
Right, but the rulebook guarantees a skewed outcome. If the rules of our political game, like the Electoral College, allow a minority to dominate, are the players cheating? Or is the rulebook inherently flawed?
Oh, that's a deep tension.
How does she reconcile that the tools used to dismantle the consensus are built directly into the Constitution she wants to protect?
Well, that tension is arguably the central paradox of the American experiment. Richardson attempts to synthesize this by redefining how we look at the Constitution.
Okay.
She frames it not as a perfect static rulebook from 1787, but as a living, pragmatic document.
Oh, I see.
It's a vehicle meant to evolve and be interpreted to better reflect the Declaration of Independence. When structural rules are weaponized to subvert equality, she argues the spirit of democracy itself is under attack.
And that really brings us to our final evaluation using Adler's ladder.
Yes.
Moving beyond information and understanding, does Democracy Awakening ultimately offer us true wisdom?
Based on our analysis, her wisdom lies in profoundly reframing the American historical narrative.
Right.
She asks us to view our national story not as a finalized divine plan, but as a perpetual, unfinished struggle between hierarchical rule and egalitarian democracy.
Because some people believe they're inherently better and more deserving of power.
Exactly. Her ultimate warning is that democracy is not a spectator sport. It doesn't run on autopilot.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over today.
Yes, think about this.
If authoritarians gain power by feeding us a mythological past, what is our civic responsibility when we consume media?
It's a great question.
Every time we scroll through our feeds, we are consuming narratives. How do we build an active immune system against comfortable patriotic myths without becoming entirely cynical about our nation's founding?
It's a tough balance.
It is. How do we hold the tension of our country's darkest flaws while still fighting for its highest ideals?
Click the link on screen for the related episodes, essential insights, summary, analysis, critique, or deep critique. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link if you'd like to read along, and think rationally. For full guides and resources, visit the TPT Google site and Patreon links in the description. Or use YouTube if you prefer captions, playback speed controls, or multilingual support. See the mini genre-based book analyses at Mindful Moments and nourish your mind on the go.